started. Hi everyone, hope you're all having a great afternoon. Welcome to our webinar on peer support for older adults. In today's webinar, we'll discuss the unique needs of older adults living with mental health diagnoses, the strengths and weaknesses of the behavioral health system in meeting their needs, and how peer support and peer-delivered services should account for the many different factors facing this age group. Today's presenter is Patrick Hendry. He's the Vice President of Peer Advocacy, Supports, and Services at Mental Health America and has worked as a mental health advocate for the past 24 years. His areas of expertise include peer-provided services, self-directed care, recovery-based trainings, organizational development, and management and sustainability. Patrick received Mental Health America's highest honor, the Clifford W. Beers Award in 2012, and the SAMHSA Voice Award and Eli Lilly Reintegration Lifetime Achievement Award in 2014. He is the former executive director of the Florida Peer Network and has assisted in the development of numerous peer-run programs and organizations. Patrick is a strong supporter of the inclusion of mental health consumers in all aspects of the behavioral health system. Some bookkeeping things just before we get started. At the top of your screen is a gray start meeting box, and there's a chat bubble there which you can click on to open up a messaging window. So if you have any questions throughout the webinar, go ahead and ask them in there, and if there's time at the end, we can go through them. And then we'll also be recording the webinar and sending it out afterwards. With that, I'll hand it over to Patrick to get started.
Thanks, Emily. We're going to, just before we get started, I want to ask the group a question, and you can just answer in the chat box, yes or no. Basically, what I'd like to know is how many of you are actually working in peer support? And then the second part of that question is, if anyone is not working in peer support directly, are they working with peer support programs? What results have we gotten so far, Emily?
So far, we have 3 answers. Everyone is working in peer support.
Okay. Well, I'll just take that as a generality then. So we're going to talk about the unique problems that we all face as we get older, and particularly those of us who have a diagnosis, and how that might affect the aging process, or how the aging process might affect psychiatric issues and other health concerns. For a number of years now, we've heard warnings about the impact of an aging population on the nation's healthcare system. And this is largely due because the baby boomer generation is, moving and is already moving right into the older adults population. And this creates a big surge in need. What we don't talk about enough, because we talk about chronic illnesses and we talk about heart disease and diabetes and COPD and lots of other chronic health conditions that tend to be worse or more dangerous as we get older. But what we don't talk about enough is the dramatically rising number of older adults with serious mental health problems. And so we're going to get into that a little bit. What I'd like to know from a few of you is why that's true. What are some of the reasons for the increase in the number of older adults with mental health problems? And don't worry, I'm not going to keep asking you questions on and on.
Jonathan mentioned more stressors in society.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's certainly true, and we see the ramifications of stress in society in so many different ways. The the fact that we are such a polarized country at this point that it, as an advocate, it becomes extremely difficult to advocate for any point of view when the system that you're advocating to, in other words, the political system, is so divided that if you go to one with a good idea, then the other side is going to immediately challenge that idea, whether they might have agreed with it or not if you'd gone to them first. So that's certainly a way it shows up. Increased violence in the country. It's also, that the way media has developed and the way instant news has developed, we are so much more aware of the stressors that are out there. Any other answers?
Yeah, Ronald mentioned longer lifespan generally, and John pointed out the baby boomer generation.
And that's, that is the basic thing. It's not really that, the rates are rising particularly, but adding to the problem, which is the increased life expectancy, so people living longer, and the aging baby boomer generation. What we also face is that, for instance, in 2015, nearly 57% of adults with psychiatric diagnoses did not receive treatment. And one of the primary reasons for that is because it's not because the treatment's not available. That does make a major impact on it. But it's also that, unfortunately, stigma continues. And we have seen in some studies recently that stigma is actually internalized more by older adults. So people who grew up under a lifestyle or a social ethic where we didn't talk about mental health problems, and it was a family issue. It was kept secret. And then as people grow older, we see that people move much more into areas of depression and anxiety. So the percentage of older adults with mental health problems isn't going up. The percentage of the worldwide population that is 65 years old is rising. This is for the first time in recorded history that the population of older people is increasing dramatically. In 2010, it was 13% of the American population. For 2020, it's projected to be 16%. So that's over, a relatively short period of time to have those kind of changes. When you talk about a 4% rise over a 10-year period, that's fairly dramatic. Between 1970 and 2016, life expectancy has gone from an average of 71 years old in the United States to 79 years old now in 2016. So people are living longer, including those of us who have mental health disorders. And this results in an overall rise in the number of adults over 65 with mental health problems. So we can see that just the arithmetic alone is probably moving the needle the furthest. But there are some things that are very unique to older adults and mental health, and we'll get into those more. This cartoon, I think, nails that. In my day, people died. Well, that's the truth. In our day, people die at a much older age, which completely changes not only the average age and things like that, but it changes the way we structure our mental health services. And we're going to talk about why that's so. So some of the factors that influence mental health in older adults, for instance, participating in meaningful activities. We know for almost everyone that it's important that some aspect of our life is concerned with doing meaningful activities, that is, activities that are meaningful to us. We know that relationships are incredibly important. We know, for instance, that single people who live alone have a shorter life expectancy than people who live with a loved one or taken in by their families or continue in their relationships. Poverty is a huge issue, and poverty is it's tied into the equation in multiple ways. First, the majority of people with serious mental health problems end up eventually, particularly those of us who became quite ill at a young age, and so we weren't able to establish, a work history and a work ethic, and consequently, when we became eligible for disability, we were not eligible for SSDI, Social Security Disability Income, but rather SSI. And for those of you who are really familiar with SSI, I think it's $770 a month now. And that's $770 a month to live on, whether you're living in, California with the highest cost of living, or you're living in a state like Arkansas that has a relatively low cost of living. So poverty really comes into it. And the other way that it comes in is as we age, many of us are not prepared sufficiently for retirement. And more people are working to a much older age now because of that. In the past, people worked for the same companies for most of their adult lives and frequently had pensions. Those things don't exist to any degree anymore. And so it's all up to the individual. People receive their Social Security disability benefit or Social Security benefit when they turn, the proper age, whichever age they choose to begin to accept it. Those of us on SSDI end up in Medicare, and those on SSI end up in Medicaid. So the problem is, particularly for the people on SSI, is that fear that if they go back to work and try and have a livable wage, one where they can have expectations of more than just living in poverty, they're desperately afraid of losing their health benefits. There's multiple programs now that are available to help people keep their Medicaid or Medicare benefits for a much longer period of time and to stretch out the period over which we start to go back to work so that we don't have to jump into it full force from the beginning. Physical health, as we know, that declines for almost all of us as we get older. And if you've had a physical problem throughout your lifetime, as your body becomes less resilient and less able to withstand chronic illnesses, then those illnesses become worse and have a greater influence on us. And then also discrimination. As I said before, people are very afraid, and particularly I think older people are afraid that if they go for mental health services, they're going to be rejected by the communities that they know, the places where they live, the circles of friends that they have, perhaps even if they're still employed by employers. And we know there's really good reason for this kind of fear. Even though there's ways around it, it's still an overriding issue for so many of us. Aging is basically a time of losses and loneliness. I mean, societal role changes with retirement. We go from being an important part of a working community to someone who is no longer working and is trying to move into retirement, perhaps with a very low income to maintain it. So their whole lifestyle has to take a change. They may have to sell their house. They may lose relationships, particularly as you get older, more and more people in your life die. And, this is a natural part of life, but it's never easy for the people that are left behind, the loved ones that are left behind. It not only creates the sadness that the people have passed away, but it also creates an issue of losing our friends, losing our loved ones, losing the people that are important to us. And that creates loneliness. And loneliness is probably the strongest driving factor behind depression in older adults. So 20% of older adults in the community at any time may be experiencing mental health problems, and that would be primarily depression and or anxiety. So recent studies show that depression can contribute to the worsening of all your other health issues, which in turn creates a higher mortality rate. So people who might have lived longer because they are suffering or living with severe depression and anxiety, what other health difficulties that they face, have a more dramatic effect on their overall health. It results in higher healthcare costs. And again, if you're living on Social Security as your basic income, and Medicare has co-pays, and it becomes more and more difficult for people to meet those increased health costs. One of the things that people that have been being tried out around the country are interdisciplinary teams, and this is teams directed at people who are older adults, and it's made up of mental health specialists, primary care specialists, and rehabilitation specialists. And these are really effective in helping people to maintain their health and wellness. A lot of peer support these days is centered around whole health. And I think that's going to only increase as time goes by. Unfortunately, these kinds of specialty team approaches are not readily available throughout the country. I think they will be increasing as time goes by, but it's we're really just starting to take this whole thing about aging and mental health seriously. And so we have a lot of questions, but very few answers so far. By the way, this is going to be a relatively short presentation. We were supposed to have a co-presenter, Tom Lane, who some of you may know. He's in charge of peer services for Magellan Managed Care. But Tom is a peer that goes way back in the peer movement and has worked in multiple states in organizing peer-run services and peer-run organizations. So another thing that we know is that suicide rate for men over 70 is the highest of any single demographic group. And if you look at this chart, the area in blue, you can see at about 70 years old, 65 to 69, it begins to go up, and it continues to go up. People 85 and older have the highest rate of suicide, and that's primarily men, because men are represented in the blue part of this chart. The orange part at the bottom are women, where actually the suicide rate goes down with increasing age. Researchers have long predicted that the number of older adults committing suicide would increase, primarily because of the aging baby boomer generation. But the primary reason for it is the prevalence of depression. So that immediately tells us if the rate of suicide is going up for men as they age and going down for women, then men are the most likely group to be living with major depression during their older years. And this creates, problems for all of us. And as these rates go up, it means that the depression is becoming a bigger factor in your life. That's why people begin to think of suicide as a viable option to a life that they're no longer enjoying. And this happens frequently. But what it means is that we've got to figure out a way to reach those men, those older men, where 57% are not accessing mental health services. So we've got to find new ways to do that. And I think peer support and some other types of support are going to help us in that journey. So what can we do? Well, many states are beginning to see peer support for older adults to be a really viable service. Pennsylvania has developed something called the Certified Older Adult Peer Specialist, or COPES program, where they train older adults who are already peer specialists. They train them in specialty areas based around mental health and living with depression as you get older. And I like this quote because it says peer support is real and it is happening, and it's going to be bigger and bigger as we move into the future. So pay attention. This is true for each of us. Peer support is going to become a much larger part of behavioral health as time goes by. And there's a number of reasons for that. Peer support is the fastest growing workforce in behavioral health. In other areas of behavioral health, in terms of psychiatrists and therapists and case managers, we're actually seeing a shrinking workforce in most cases. So that means that peers take on a bigger role, not a clinical role by any means, but they take on a bigger role. And this is really good because when peers are able to engage with people at the earliest possible time, because the system can't bring people in for, to begin med management or to receive therapy, can't bring them in within a reasonable amount of time. And there are multiple months waiting lists in various parts of the country just to get your first appointment through community mental health. So peers are more readily available, and they can begin to meet with people while they're going through that initial wait period. So COPES is based on the idea of mutuality, as is peer support in general. And that's the idea that the supporter and the person receiving support are equal and that their relationship is reciprocal. In other words, we both get something from that relationship. Peer support has long been said to be based on a very basic, simple premise that's been around for a long time, and that's called the helper principle. The helper principle says that the person providing help receives as much or more help from that relationship as the person they're providing the help to. There were some studies done in the 1960s that actually showed that the helper received more benefit than did the person they were providing help to. Now, maybe that was true then. We've become much better in the ways that we provide peer support. Peer support in behavioral health has become far more formalized, and we have excellent trainings all over the country. In many states, you have your choice of multiple different trainings that you can take. And we are setting higher and higher standards for people to become certified peer specialists. And many states still, 4 states still don't have certification on a statewide level. California, being the largest state with peer support in the country, still does not have its certification process in place. It's estimated that there are over 6,000 peer specialists working in California, and estimates overall for the country, there's not been a recent study, but based on the last couple of studies, it puts the total number of certified peer specialists at somewhere around 35 to 40,000 people at this time. So older adults face many different stressors than younger adults. So a certified older adult peer specialist is really prepared to work in issues of aging and the principles of wellness and coaching, because they identify with the same things that the people they're serving. And that's why it's really important. I know there are some programs out there where peer specialists are hired to work with a older population of people, but the peer specialist doesn't have any kind of age requirement for the job. And so in many cases, you'll have a younger peer specialist working with an older person. And that can be very, very beneficial. But it leaves out one of the important parts, and that's that quality that we would call peerness. If I'm 30 years old and you're 70 years old, and we both have a diagnosis and have been through the system, are we really peers? That answer comes down to the individual who's going to receive the support. A peer is whoever the person says is their peer. No place is it more prevalent than among vets. I've done some work with the Veterans Administration over the years, and I was working on a training course on providing homeless outreach peer specialists for the VA. And I'm not a vet. And so when I would try to go to the homeless camps and the woods camps around, I had to actually be accompanied by a vet before anybody was willing to really talk to me and open up to me. What I found out in the VA is if you're going to be a peer specialist, then you need to be a vet. And if you're going to be a peer supporter to a combat veteran, probably you're going to need to have had that experience too. The same thing with women veterans. Women veterans have faced some unique challenges in our society, some very tough ones. The military system is slow to change, even when it intends to change, and consequently women are not given the respect and the attention that they deserve as members of the military. So, what it gets back to is in order to be a real peer, for most of us, we want somebody who's as much like us as possible, without all the issues that we face. These are people who have already faced those issues and can come to us with some strategies for us to face them. The COPE program prepares older adult peer specialists to provide hope, empowerment, choice, and opportunities through support and shared experience. And that's the same as a peer specialist at any age. COPEs, or certified older adult peer specialists, are prepared to work with individuals in a variety of settings, just as many peer specialists who work in the community are. In this case, though, they may be working in senior citizens and in housing for seniors and in health clinics that specialize in older adult health care. So again, you need to have that knowledge of how that system works. And the only way you can have the real true knowledge of navigating through the system of care as an older adult or for older adults is that you've experienced it yourself. So COPES offers a really wide range of services. They have support groups that they provide facilitation for. They do advocacy work. They do administrative support within agencies. Again, they may be the program director for a program that is specifically directed at older adults, and many, many other things. And so we're finding out that not just the COPES program, but the idea of a special type of peer specialist who is well-versed in these unique issues is very, very valuable to us and is becoming more valuable each day. There was another program that was done not too long ago. It was published in the Gerontologist in 2013, and it was called Reclaiming Joy. And this was a peer intervention for older adults. So some of the premises that they started off with were that stigma and lack of access to services creates significant barriers to mental health treatment for older adults living in the community. And that's true. I mean, that's true for people who are not older adults. The same thing. Stigma, in other words, societal attitudes towards something that they don't fully understand, in this case it being psychiatric issues. We have a society that prolongs these ideas that mental health issues are more closely linked to violence than they really are. We know that people with a mental health problem are far more likely to be a victim than a perpetrator. We also know, for instance, that people with major diagnoses, so that'd be schizophrenia and schizoaffective disorder, bipolar disorder, and major depression, they make up about 4% of the population of the United States. People with any type of major diagnosis who have been involved in a violent crime, been a perpetrator of a violent crime, make up about 4.7% of the population. So that's not a big difference. In other words, we're about the same as everybody else in our relationship to violence. and yet we're far more likely to be victims than other people. Volunteers in this Reclaiming Joy, it was based around a volunteer system, and so it's the pairing of an older adult volunteer with somebody who's had lived experience with the same kinds of issues, with a participant who would be, in this case, an older adult who receives peer support. So these volunteers do go through specific training, and it's strength-based. It's geared towards mental health and aging, goal setting and attainment, finding and navigating community resources, and establishing safety for people as they begin to age. Safety is an issue that we frequently overlook unless we're talking about trauma-informed peer support, which is an area where safety is just, paramount to be dealt with as the first issue that we approach, is making sure that someone who has lived through traumatic events and has been severely affected by it needs to feel safe before they can open up, before they can trust, and before they can begin to make changes. So in this program, the participants and the volunteer would meet once a week for 10 weeks. And the participants would establish and work towards goals that would improve their mental health and well-being. So in this pilot program that was conducted, in the initial pilot, there's ongoing programs using the Reclaiming Joy system, but the one that was used as the pilot and has the statistical information behind it, there were 32 participants. Pre and post assessments showed significant improvement for depression, but not really for the symptoms of anxiety. Interestingly enough, though, it showed an increased feeling of quality of life, and this is for people not only with depression, but also with anxiety. So while it's not necessarily working to lessen the symptoms of anxiety, it's helping people who do experience it to feel that their quality of life is improving. The implications of the pilot shows that it has the potential for reducing depression and increasing quality of life in low-income older adults with co-occurring physical health conditions. Now, why we put that last part in about, with low-income older adults with co-occurring physical health conditions is this program, like many programs, excuse me, I'm very hoarse today. This program, like many pilot programs, tries to choose people that will be the most difficult to make changes or to help make changes in their life. So they chose people who were from low-income areas. They chose people with ongoing co-occurring physical health conditions. But the program shows that it can help people in each of those conditions. In the State of Mental Health and Aging in America, which was put out by the Center for Disease Control and the National Association of Chronic Disease Directors, it says the presence of depressive disorders often adversely affect the course and complicates the treatment of other chronic diseases. So the more that people live with depression, as we said earlier, the more all of their health conditions are impacted negatively. Depression is the most prevalent mental health problem among older adults. We know that peer support is very effective at helping people to link to their community and to resources. Social connections and opportunities to continue to participate in your community instead of living in isolation, being left out because you've lost your friends or you don't have transportation or any number of the things that affects people as they grow older. We know that those folks do much worse in their life than people who maintain connections And so that's one of the important elements that peer support can bring the most to the table. Does anybody have any questions so far?
Nope, there hasn't been anything posted.
Okay. So, consequently, adequate social and emotional support is associated very closely with reduced risk of mental illness, physical illness, and mortality. So just think about that. You know, I mean, many of us have gone through periods of isolation in the course of our recovery. And we know that when we're isolated, not only does it increase all of the negative aspects of our disorders, but it also dramatically lowers our quality of life. Approximately 1/5 of Hispanic and this must be a typo, it says and other non-Hispanic adults, that would mean everyone, age 65 years or older, have reported that they don't receive the support they need compared to 1/10 of older white adults. So there is supposed to be a distinguishing part to that sentence. I'm afraid I wrote it out incorrectly. But in other words, that you know, just the same as everything else in our society, you know, the white population has an advantage over almost any other cultural or ethnic group in our country. And this continues, but we're trying to change it. And peer support is a good place to change it because peer support needs to be available to all types of people. And that may mean that we need people who speak a language, you know, a dialect of a language that we've never even heard of in order to get support. I know, for instance, in LA County, there are over 100, and I don't remember exactly how many, there's over 100 different languages and dialects that are spoken. And the mental health system tries to keep up with that. And the way they do it in LA is that they hire translators when they're doing work with people from, you know, more minority ethnic or population groups. Among adults 50 or older, men were way more likely than women to report that they rarely or never received the support they needed. Many older adults don't seek treatment for depression because they believe that depression is something everyone experiences and should be able to deal with on their own. Now, all of us, you know, working in peer support, we've heard this. We've probably had somebody say something similar to that to us when we were experiencing some of the more difficult parts of our conditions. And it's that, you know, pull yourself up by your bootstraps thought process behind this. Baby boomers are particularly bad at this. We grew up in a generation where everything was possible. The U.S. economy was expanding rapidly. It was changing. You know, the standard of living was going up for each person. More and more services were becoming available. Community mental health started in the early 1960s. So baby boomers grew up with all these expectations that they could go out in their life and do whatever they chose to do that was meaningful to them. And many of us have tried to teach our children some of those same aspects. The thing is that they don't live in the same world that we did at their age. And so younger people coming up now and working in peer support or working in any kind of social support aspect have had a completely different experience in systems than maybe we did. You know, a lot of people in the baby boom generation also were treated quite badly and, in fact, brutally in the psychiatric system. And in 1955, we had over 550,000 people in state psychiatric hospitals. There's now less than 50,000, which I think is still too many. But the other thing that's changed, not only has it gone down, to just 10% or less of what it once was, 50, 60 years ago, but it's also completely changed in the way that these facilities are run. And while they still need a lot of work, and there's still some hospitals that are extremely negative in the way they deal with people, and often, create more trauma and create more lifelong difficulties than they prevent, the bulk of the system is getting better and continues to get better. And so it's going to be really important, and it's going to be really interesting to see where, younger people working in these areas are going to take us. I participated in a workshop in Philadelphia about a month ago or so, and people talk a lot about ageism, and that's mostly referring to older adults not being able to get jobs, not being part of mainstream of society, feeling left out because they're older. But ageism also exists for young people, and so there was this group of young women, 3 young women. One was 18, one was 19, and one was 20. And they were talking about what they referred to as adultism. And that's this tendency to treat young people who may or may not be living with psychiatric issues about the way we treat people with major mental illness, who are older, and that we take away rights, or we don't even take away rights. We don't give people the same rights at that age that they get as they get older. One of the basic concepts of our Constitution is that no taxation without representation. Well, think about it. I mean, I started work when I was 12, and people, if they earn very much money, whatever age they start at, they pay taxes. And they don't have representation in our government. Now, is that something we can accomplish? I don't know. But it's really interesting to see that the younger people are feeling that they are being discriminated against in much the same ways that older people are feeling the same thing. Peer support workforce has grown tremendously. And while the average age of peer support workers is actually going down because more young people are choosing to get certified and work in peer support, many of the most effective and experienced peer support staff members are aging baby boomers. Peer support really came into its time in the late 80s into the 90s, and the first certification was only created in 2001 in Georgia. So a lot of people have been working in peer support for many decades, and these are people we can't afford to lose because they bring such a wealth of knowledge and experience. And so we have to make sure that we find ways to utilize that knowledge and experience. One way is creating these new positions of peer specialists who work with older adults. Another way is to move people who have that amount of knowledge and experience into training positions, supervision positions, program director positions, and really any type of position in a mental health facility hierarchy. When older adult peer specialists are given the opportunity for training in these specific skills of working with older adults, they really represent an incredibly powerful asset for improving and even saving lives of their own contemporaries. There's an interesting drop-in center in Lauderhill, Florida, which is near Fort Lauderdale. And it's called Silver Impact, and it's been around for a long time. I'm not sure what year it started, but I've been aware of it for at least 15 years, and I think it goes way back before that. But the Silver Impact Center is a drop-in center for older adult, people with mental health difficulties. They support recovery through stimulating programs and emotionally engaging programs. In other words, bringing people out of that darkness that old age can move you into, bringing people out, giving them something that stimulates their mind, giving them a way to emotionally attach to a cause or a group or a person. So the Silver Impact Center is continuing on, and it's expanding. It's getting better. It's really an interesting place. If you're ever in that area, I suggest you go see it. And other similar programs are starting to build up around the country. So really, as kind of my last slide, but not the end of the conversation, I love this quote from C.S. Lewis, who wrote Alice in Wonderland. You can't go back and change the beginning, but you can start where you are and change the ending. And that's what we're talking about doing. As we age, we can't go back and if only I had done this, or if only this had happened. We can't do that. But what we can do is begin to bring about change now and work towards goals that fit our life at this point. So community is really the answer. Being able to help people connect to community. We have communities of people living with mental health issues, but we also need people to connect to the larger communities around them. And that's because those communities are so much more rich in resources than the mental health community is. I mean, if you live in any, even a small town, there's generally community activities that are often free, things like art lessons or music concerts, or for instance, I was running a community inclusion program, and we had people looking for things that they enjoyed to do and then trying to find ways that they could do it at no cost or very little cost. And we found out that there was one woman who really loved to bake. And so we found a meetup group that was free for people who were interested in baking. And then they went on to come together to form a group that got together on a regular basis. And this way they were able to relate to each other and actually form friendships that had nothing to do with the mental health world, but more to do with what people like to have in their life. So I'd like to hear some comments, because how many of you count yourself as an older adult? Let's say 60 or older, or even 55 or older. Let's say 55 or older. Just if we could do a quick poll, how many people are in that group? We have some answers, Emily?
We've got one who's 60.
We have just one person saying they're 60 years old, so the rest of you are very young. So, well, tell your older friends about this, because as I've said over and over, it's just really important that we always meet that goal of the other person accepting us as a true peer. And we can't just hang it around the issue of mental health experiences or mental health problems experiences. There needs to be more to create a true connection, I think. Now, for some of us, that's all that's available. And if that's all that's available, it's certainly better than nothing. Peer support is valuable wherever you can get it. But again, the closer you can align yourself to the people you're serving so that you're sharing experience, and maybe you've experienced these things before they are confronted with them, then people will be stronger in their recovery. And I think we will see that as we begin to meet the needs, the mental health needs of our older population, that those, average age numbers will continue to go up, perhaps at even an increasing rate, and that we will see that, not only do people live longer, but they live healthier lives and stay active much longer and are actually doing things that they want to do. So again, like I said, this is a relatively short webinar because Tom Lane was unable to participate, but we're going to try and have another one basically on the same issue, but coming at it from some very different angles with Tom when his time is up. I hope some of you at least will be able to.
Patrick, we do have a few questions coming in if you want to answer some of those.
Absolutely.
Rita said she was curious about your experience with the VA and had a similar experience, and was wondering if you think peers need to be older adults to support older adults.
Well, I think you don't have to be an older adult to support older adults. I think it just makes the bond stronger. And if you are an older adult in a support role, you've probably experienced more of the things that the person you're providing support to has. So, you're experiencing some of the health problems that come with aging. Perhaps you're experiencing the changes in economics because of retirement or, going on to Social Security. You may be experiencing the loss of loved ones and cherished friends and relationships in general as people get older and we lose them. So in that sense, it's very good to be an older adult who provides support. But if you are a peer support specialist and you're what's available to somebody, you're still extremely valuable no matter what their age is. What was the other part of the question, the VA?
Yes, your experience with the VA.
So again, my experience with the VA, as I said, I was helping write this course for the University of South Florida that had this contract with the VA to establish a new position that I don't think ever has taken on fully in the VA, but it was homeless outreach peer specialist. And so, as I said, in my experience, in order for me to get real good information from people who were vets and were homeless, for me to go and find out what their needs were and what would be the requirements of a homeless outreach peer specialist for vets. I didn't have access to a lot of that information because, people didn't know me. They were suspicious of me. But I went to these camps with vets from the VA center, and it's amazing to me because I think vets realize that they're around other vets very quickly. And I'm not quite sure what it is that does that. It may be something they've said, but it may just be, for all we know, it's an emotional connection. So the VA, we completed the course, and I know that they started training in the Tampa, Clearwater, St. Pete area, and it was supposed to expand out. I haven't really followed it since then, but I do believe that in order to be the best peer support person you can be for a veteran, then you need to be a vet yourself. Other question?
Yeah, one other was, do you think Medicaid will eventually fund peer support?
Well, Medicaid does fund peer support in over, I think it's 38 states, and it might be higher. But they do in a number of different ways. Managed care, Medicaid managed care, is the biggest source of peer support to people in community mental health. And so they take Medicaid dollars, which are given to managed care companies who have a lot of leeway in how they can target those funds to help the largest number of people with the best possible support they can give. So, I ran a peer-run organization in the state of Florida for a number of years, and managed care was just getting started in Florida, and we were against it. We were very much against it because We looked at Medicaid. We knew that there was an X amount of dollars available. At that time, it was being spent on a fee-for-service rate. So, in other words, you went, you got a service from your doctors doing med management. You billed some Medicaid. Medicaid pays them. They decided to do this, managed care. So these larger companies came in. What we found out was that it was a really competitive market for these managed care companies. So they started talking to groups like mine all around the country. What can we do better that will make us, provide better services? And part of that question that was left unsaid was, what can we do to make it more likely that we'll get the contract? And so peer service, peer support was a big part of that. So Medicaid dollars are being spent for it. There are also some waivers under Medicaid rules that allow peer support to be paid for under a number of different mechanisms. And in those cases, they can be fee-for-service in some of the places. I don't know what state you're asking from, but like I said, the last number I remember is 38, but I was just at a conference and somebody I think told me it was higher than that now, that allowed Medicaid to be spent.
And what about Medicare?
Medicare does not pay for peer support. They have okayed some peer support as part of the opioid addictions programs that are proliferating around the country, with a small amount and a very specific role. I know Mental Health America, we have been working very closely with Center for Medicaid and Medicare Services for years to get Medicare to recognize peer support as a really highly useful system of care. And, we, as peer supporters, we like to think that what we do is improve people's lives. That's the bottom line. If we're not improving their life, we're not doing it right. But the providers also have to look at, where can we get the most bang for our buck? In other words, and so they're turning to peer support, because peer support is a relatively inexpensive service that fills a lot of gaps in the system, and consequently, it frees up some money to provide more services to more people and better access. But Medicare at this point is not funding peer services other than these very small substance use programs that they're funding. Other questions?
That's it so far, unless anyone has any last-minute things to pop in there. Going back to the concept of peerness, though, Kelly mentioned a good point in the chat that she sees that being within the same age is important, and her dad is a Vietnam vet and won't open up to her, but will open up to other Vietnam vets at the VA.
Yeah. I mean, that was another group that I became very aware of, were the vets from the Vietnam War, and then vets from, the first Gulf War, or, Afghanistan and Iraq, or any other type of conflict area. They tended to form their own groups. And so not only did I have to, what I needed to be a vet, but if I was going to work with Vietnam vets, and I'm of that age, that's the group I would have been working with, then I need to have experienced Vietnam. And again, like I said, I was told on multiple occasions that if the person you're serving is a combat vet, they will primarily choose another combat vet to be their support person. So Kelly's exactly right, because this is true not only for older people, it's true for young people, like I said before. And we, the reason why we're not doing a better job at that is not because we don't want to. It's because funding has been so small. For instance, I live in a town with about 100,000 people. We have one medium-sized community mental health center. and then we have one peer-run drop-in center. So between those two groups, all the peer roles exist. Well, the Community Mental Health Center, the last I checked, only was funding 6 or 7 peer support positions, and the drop-in center was funding considerably more than that. But they were only funding that many because that's all the money that they were getting from the state and Medicaid services that they could afford to do. And so consequently, it's like you take what's available to you. You go to a center to get help and you want peer support, and there's nobody under the age of 40 or under the age of 30, and you're 20. It's difficult. It's difficult. We speak different languages. We've had different experiences in life. We have different goals. We've had different expectations put on us by society. So I think it is important, and as peer support matures, hopefully there will be a much greater variety of people providing peer support, not only by age, but also by ethnicity, by other cultural issues. I was in a meeting for peer support in Olympia, Washington 3 weeks ago, and one of the big issues that came up was the LGBT community and peer support that really could meet their needs. And even within that group, there were a couple of people that spoke specifically to the needs of the trans community, that they didn't feel like they could be truly supported by somebody who didn't understand that experience. So let's hope that it expands to the point where we can each find what we need to be able to move on and really find that meaningful life. Well, if that's it, I want to thank you all, and I hope this was somewhat useful to you. It's really, the purpose of this is for us to all begin to think about this. I mean, this is, it's a huge bump in the population, the baby boomers. And as they go into this period of time where they need supports that are different than people in their 40s or 30s or 20s or 50s even, we need people who can relate to that and can be there for them. So that's what I wanted to accomplish with this webinar, was to get you thinking along these lines, and hopefully the organizations you work with will think along these lines, and we'll begin to see more specialized roles for peer support for older adults. Thank you.